Excellent. Okay. Everyone, thanks so much for joining us. This is called TA Talks, and it's a networking group designed for talent acquisition professionals like yourselves. Thank you for taking the time out. We're looking to run this for about 45 minutes, and the aim of the session really is to try and give some candidates a little bit of insight from your perspective on how they can make themselves more marketable and give themselves the best chance of standing out. I sent everyone an email to invite you to the session, and apologies if it came across slightly bleak. Some of my colleagues thought I painted too dark a picture, but unfortunately, the reality of what's happened with COVID-19 is that there have been quite a lot of redundancies. The employment market is increasing in number, and it will probably, unfortunately, steadily rise over the next few months. So I've personally found that the job adverts we've put out, we've had more applicants than we ever have. So I think that the question from people that we talk to is, how can they give themselves the best chance of getting an interview with an organisation? What can they do with their CV before they get the chance to talk to a company to give themselves the best possible chance? So we've got a few questions that I'm going to try and rattle through as kind of quickly as we can. First of all, I'd like to kind of go around everyone individually to give you all the chance to talk, and then I'm going to open up into more of a free-flowing discussion, if that's okay. The first question that we've got is, so there are 100 applicants for a job. What would be the main criteria that you would use to screen these and whittle that down to a short list that you might pass on to a hiring manager? And Ben, if it's okay, can I come to you first?
Yeah, absolutely. So primarily, I'm going to be working straight from the company's job requirement, which will contain what we call the basic qualifications segment. If you have clearly demonstrated in your CV that you match all of the BQs or basic requirements, basic qualifications, which are required for that position, then I would immediately move your profile through to my long listing phase. From a CV perspective and how candidates can help themselves really stand out in actually getting to that stage, make sure that you review the basic qualification section. Now, that's just the terminology that we use at Amazon. Maybe other companies might have the base requirements or absolutely whatever it is, the essential skills that have to be on your CV. Be really realistic with yourself and be honest with yourself. Do you genuinely match that criteria? If you do, fantastic. Make sure that it is prominently displayed on your CV, because the recruiter typically is going to have hundreds of applications to wade through. So what they're going to do is they're going to glance at your intro summary. If they're looking for a senior software engineer and you have senior software engineer listed in your intro summary, they're going to, you're past the first hurdle. They're going to move on. Next up, they're going to jump straight to your current role. They're going to look at things like your company that you work for, the job title that you have, the content, and the duration. If you've only been at your current employer for 6 months, then they're going to look to your next role and see to make sure that that's also aligned with the criteria that they've got. Typically, most recruiters won't go past the previous 5 years of your employment history. So as long as that first, the intro summary and the current role, or the role prior to that as well, as long as that all screams, I meet the basic requirements for this job, you have an incredibly high chance of getting through to the next phase.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Margaret?
Yeah, so apart from what Ben shared, which I absolutely agree with, I would say you absolutely need to mention some tangible achievements. I see so many CVs that are very duty oriented. So the person will mention what they've done, but not really enough about what they've achieved. So I would definitely recommend that you try to quantify your experience and use some numbers. So maybe you've helped a website scale. So don't just write it verbatim, like put a metric in there. So for example, I helped the website scale from 10,000 views per day to 100,000 views per day. So make sure that you have some specific quantifiable achievements. You definitely need some keywords, but again, don't stuff your CV with keywords. So whatever the requirements on the job description are, so maybe it's Java or Python or Hadoop or real-time, you want to make sure that these keywords are immediately visible to the recruiter within seconds of looking at your CV. But again, it's not about stuffing your CV with 50 different keywords. But I would definitely make sure that the main keywords from the job description, if you have that experience, especially from the desirable list, right? Because you will have the basic qualifications, but there's also typically, preferred qualification or desirable qualifications. If you have that experience, then make sure that's in your skills section or in your summary section, and that you can also explain how you've used that in different projects. I would definitely include some, you can include your LinkedIn profile or GitHub, for example, if you're a developer. Use an active verbs and active voice. So use verbs like designed or implemented or executed, drove or planned. I would avoid responsible for, because that's like, it doesn't actually tell me how good you were at the job. I would also like pick 2 or 3 projects that you know really well, and make sure that you have them on your CV as well. And you should really know them from top to bottom, front to back. Knowing 2 or 3 projects really well shows dedication and ability to ship things, if you're a developer, like to desirable traits any company needs. And be consistent. Like some CVs I see are very like the design doesn't look great. I mean, I don't really care about design as such, but you want to make sure that you use consistent font, that you maybe have 2 pages, not 5 pages, and no more than 3 font sizes for readability. And you want to like really explain, I think for any role you apply for, you want to explain why you're suitable for the position. So, you can write a cover letter, but really your CV should show why you're suitable for the position. So make sure that you tailor your summary section, which I would recommend everyone has, or your skills section, or both, for every position that you apply for, so that anyone who looks at your CV, even if they're going through hundreds of applications, they can tell right away that you have the skills that they are looking for.
Excellent, thank you. Written some good notes there as well. Sophie?
Hi, so I think that's some great advice already from Ben and Margaret. I'd just add that it's really interesting that the typical amount of time usually spent by a recruiter looking at a CV is only 7 seconds. So you've got to make those 7 seconds count. So that means using things like bold titles, using bullet points as well. And also, please, please, please spell check. I know it seems really obvious, but I see so many CVs with really silly mistakes. And that just puts me in a negative frame of mind, unfortunately. And even making sure you're using the right version of the word. So my pet hate is principal. The number of times I see the incorrect principal being used on CVs is amazing. So I think those are a couple of the key points around the basics of a CV, together with what Ben and Margaret have mentioned. But I'd also encourage you, in the light of COVID, to think about organisational design, actually. So I think what's really important, and we're seeing a move to, is people who are more T-shaped and even M-shaped now. So that means not being a deep specialist in one particular area, but showing your potential adaptability for future employers. I think particularly for perm roles, that's going to be increasingly important. So for example, if you're a software engineer, think about maybe bringing out some of your skills around working as a BA or acting as a delivery lead. I think as we go forward, that adaptability, flexibility within a workforce is going to be increasingly important. And to try and draw that out on your CV, I think will help you in good stead. Perhaps not at the initial long listing stage, but maybe in the short listing stage.
Okay, thank you. Lee?
Yeah, hi. So some really good points covered off there. A few things I just wanted to add really to the list that might be of use. So when you think about the industry that you're applying to, whether you're a specialist in, for example, finance or retail, whatever it might be worth sort of thinking about the language that you're using, that's obviously relevant to the industry that you're applying to. And then possibly on the recruiter being a little bit more scrutinous, something to highlight is often we do see CVs with gaps, and that's fine, they can usually be explained, but sometimes the gaps are not explained on the CV, and it might just be worth inserting a sentence or two to explain what you were doing during that period. And also, if you're a contractor that's considering moving over to perm for whatever reason, it might be worth explaining that in your introductory profile, like what the thought process is behind that, because sometimes that can be a red flag to recruiters. because there are sort of factors around the salary differentiations and things like that that often mean that we have conversations that don't get past this kind of first step. So it'd be nice to have something on that on your CV as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, because that's one that we come up against a lot of the time, and it's a question that invariably, we'll get asked by our customers. It'll be the first question that's asked, because if we send a CV and someone's had sort of 5 different contract jobs in the last 2 years and now they're looking for a perm job, that employer is looking to get, I don't know, good on average 2 to 3 years service out of that person. You would hope on a perm role.
Yeah.
And it's tough, because I suppose the reality is that some people, quite frankly, if they can't find a contract role, they're considering perm because they need a job, which is totally understandable. But maybe it would be useful if candidates were just as honest as they could be about their reasons. And I suppose it just helps to get some more personality across as well, doesn't it, if they do that. Cheers for that, Lee. Tilly?
Yeah, thanks. So as a 5th of 5 on this question,
Sorry, mate,
I feel the guys have been very, very comprehensive, and I certainly don't want to repeat anything the guys have said. I think the big thing about standing out is using the content to stand out. Right, I've seen a lot of CVs which have colours or pictures, and that's not necessarily the way it's positively standing out to us as recruiters. I think it's a lot in the clear and simple way it's structured, to what Margaret and Sophie were saying, using bold where it's necessary, but not necessarily using 15 different colours, having some pictures in. I think for better or worse, the traditional looking CV is still probably the easiest for us as recruiters to digest. Whether that's right or wrong, and kind of the industry should be evolving is a slightly different question, I guess. But at this point, I think that's how you stand out, is having a really clear, structured, and concise CV. And what I mean by concise is having key information, not, again, sort of to Margaret's point, not having every project you've ever done on there, because there won't be enough space, but having the key ones you want to highlight that's relevant for the role, and having them in enough detail with tangible information that a recruiter is going to see and going to read. Ultimately, from a recruiter perspective, at that point, we just want a reason, or enough reasons, to give you a call and find out a little bit more. And depending on the job, that could be, like in the example you gave, that could be 100 candidates. So we know at best we're going to speak to 20% of that, maybe 15, 10%, depending on the role. So that's all I'd say to add on to what the guys have said.
Yeah, thanks. No, some good stuff there. Thanks very much. The next ones are interesting in that I see a lot of candidates who write covering letters, and I suppose, I'm sure they spend a lot of time in doing that. Often those are, totally individual, tailored to the job they're applying for. Sometimes they're not, and sometimes they're just an extension of a CV. But I think it would be helpful if people kind of give an insight into, do these get looked at, or do you go straight to a CV? Someone want to pick that one up?
To be quite frank, I know that our ATS and all the ATSs that I've worked with, probably in the last 5 years, have the option to upload a cover letter. It's generally optional. I would say I've looked at maybe 5 in the last 5 years, just because, again, to what people have said, if that information isn't in the CV, it probably isn't going to be in the sufficient detail to make me want to shortlist them. Now, there'll be instances where I might look at it. Now, in certain other, if you're in design, you might upload a portfolio, etc. But that traditional cover letter for me seems a little bit redundant in places I've worked in how my teams have recruited.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, Margaret.
No, I think I would agree with that. I mean, I typically look at the CV, and exactly as you've said, if the information isn't there, I'm probably not going to look at the cover letter, even though sometimes, of course, the company does request the cover letter, but it actually doesn't have to take that long to create one. I do think it can help because, everyone is so different. Like my experience is mostly in internal recruitment, and actually I had hiring manager who really read every single cover letter, and they liked it when the candidate made it specific and tailored it to a specific position. So, if it's not required, you don't need to do that. But I think a very brief cover letter, and I'm literally talking about 3 paragraphs, like half a page, so it's very easy for someone to read. I think that could be a good idea sometimes. But again, this information really should be on your CV, but if there's anything specific that you want to emphasize. So I would keep it super brief, first line, why you're interested in the role, maybe just a few bullet points about why you're suitable. And again, mention some quantifiable achievements. Again, numbers are easy, use some numbers to impress people as well. And that's it, So if you do use a cover letter, I would just say keep it brief. No one honestly will have time to read like a 2-page CV. Very brief, I think, can help.
Just to echo what Tilly and Margaret said, I wouldn't say that a covering letter is completely obsolete and gone the way of the dinosaur just yet. However, they are definitely phasing out. I would say it's more a judgment call. If a company doesn't specifically request that you send one and you're applying via an internal recruiter or an external recruiter, you don't really need to send a cover letter, because the reality is, as Tilly said, he's looked at 5 in the past 5 years. I think I've looked at less than that in the last decade. Covering letters for me, it's not something that I need to see. I did pull some statistics on this. So the Society for Human Resources Management says that currently 84% of employers are working via social media to find the talent that they're interested in. That means that they're coming directly to you. So the majority of the time they'll be bypassing that stage of the CV application and the covering letter anyway. So again, the Boston-based agency Addison Group, they say that only 18% of hiring managers actually bother to look at or request or say a covering letter is of import to them anyway. So it's definitely good to keep one fresh and relevant and to tailor them, as Margaret said, to the position that you're applying for if requested. But if it's not requested, I really think that they are, any good proactive recruiter should really be that bridging the gap between you and the hiring manager anyway. And we as good recruiters should be becoming effectively what used to be the requirement of a covering letter.
I think it's probably also one of those things where, and I don't know if we'll touch on this later, but if you're applying for a job that is kind of a vertical move or a horizontal move for you, it probably isn't as necessary. Where it might become more useful is if you're trying to transfer your skills into something slightly different to what you've done previously. I guess in something like that, your CV might not allow you to really demonstrate your ability to do that job, and some additional information about how those skills transfer could be included in the cover letter. But again, to Ben's point, if you're working through an internal or external recruiter, that stuff's probably having conversation anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. I try and read covering letters, especially if they're speculative applications, but I'll always read them after a CV. And actually, I find them quite useful sometimes to get feedback on what candidates or potential employees think of our brand or our website or interactions they've had with us as well.
Okay, cool. If no one else got anything else to say on that one, the next point is around education history. So certainly the CVs that I see, education history is sometimes the first thing you see, sometimes it's the last thing you see on a CV, sometimes it's not there at all. Obviously, I think everyone will realise that it will differ from job to job to a certain extent how important the education history is. For example, if you're recruiting for a graduate training program, I suspect that the education history is going to be pretty important. But if we just kind of look down the tech route for now, if we can, how important would the education history be, do you think?
I think for the benefit of the CV, it's probably something that would be towards the bottom end or the back page on the CV. From my experience, like for tech in particular, it's all about the technical skills, which I know is kind of the next point that we might discuss. So I don't want to try and muddy the two too much. But I think from a candidate point of view, applying to an ATS is one method. But if you're somebody that's got your CV on a job board, you need to consider how an external recruiter or an internal recruiter is actually going to find your CV. And obviously the importance of keywords and Boolean is how the recruiter performs his search, and it's also how high the candidate's CV is going to appear on the results in a search. So therefore, using that top part of your CV to put your education history is probably going to be detrimental to your application. If anything, you want all your key skills and key words towards the top end of the CV so that recruiters can find you. And that goes with your LinkedIn profile as well, if you was to talk about both.
Yeah, I think echoing what Lee said there, for me, you can mention it briefly in the introduction to your CV. You know, if you have an MSc or a BSc or a PhD and it's relevant to the position that you're applying for, definitely tie that into the introduction. But I would not recommend people dedicating an education segment at the top of their CV. It should be underneath, at the bottom of all of your employment. Now, if you're applying for something very complex like a solution architecture role with a specific technology stack, and you have accreditations and certifications within those, you know, if you're applying for a project management role and you have Prince2 certification, sure, definitely, again, flag those in your introduction so that the recruiter's attention has been grabbed, but don't dedicate a huge section to it immediately. Leave it for later on. That's my experience and my advice.
And I think there's a distinction there between the professional qualifications and the academic ones as well. I think going back a little bit, almost before the CV, I, especially in kind of looking at things from a diversity and inclusivity perspective, I think, you know, as recruiters, we should really be challenging hiring managers and requirements that put too much emphasis on degree qualifications and 2-1s except and above kind of requirements, because
absolutely,
we all know that, you know, there's certain privileges that allow us to go to university or allow us to dedicate as much time to education. It allows us to get a 2-1, etc. So how that affects someone's ability to fulfill a project manager role, a software engineering position is, you know, especially after years of experience, is questionable. So I agree. It should, from a practical perspective, in terms of where you want to be in a search, it doesn't need to be high, but equally, I think more and more employers are seeing that it's not the most important thing.
Definitely. That's a great point, Tilly.
To what you said, that if the education is listed, if the education requirements are listed as one of the first requirements on the job description, definitely flag it. Or, you know, if you have computer science masters from, say, Imperial, you know, and there will be hiring managers that I have worked with that they really want some good education, I think then maybe, just maybe flag it. You don't need to list it on page 1, but education will be important to some hiring managers. And if it's listed pretty high on the job description, I would just say definitely flag it, you know, whether it's a very brief section or just in your summary section. If you have first in computer science from Cambridge or from Imperial, like I think I would want to see that on page 1. So it could be in your summary section.
I guess my challenge to that a little bit is why, depending on why someone, that qualification makes them a better, say, Java developer.
Not necessarily. That's in addition to the skills that you have. If you have 2 candidates with the same skills, of course, just education doesn't mean that you're a better developer. But if you have the same skill set and then you have another person who has, you know, first in computer science from a really reputable university, I think that potentially would be a more attractive candidate. But education on its own.
I think I totally get Tilly's point and Margaret's as well. We're trained now to challenge what we call education bias and not to believe that just because somebody went to XYZ university that necessarily means that they're more qualified or capable for a role. However, I would say play it by ear. Speak to your recruiter. Your recruiter knows the hiring manager ultimately. If they know that they like to see that and you're trying to stand out, then use whatever tools you've got at your dispense. And as Margaret says, if that specific hiring manager is unfortunately biased towards a particular university and you happen to have attended that and you want to stand out, then certainly putting a spotlight on that I don't think is going to hurt. But I would not be inclined to put somebody in a higher echelon personally.
Yeah, No, okay, and I think you we've all kind of agreed. It depends. It obviously depends on the role. It depends on the organisation, how much that matters. Out of interest, would you say that increasingly, like over the course? So let's say, for example, you're looking for someone with like 6 months experience, then I would guess that education history at that point might be slightly more important.
Oh,
Whereas if you go up to 6 years experience or 16 years experience, that that kind of first from Cambridge versus that candidate who's a rock star Java developer, it gradually, the education history, it makes less of a difference, do you think?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. I think if you're brand new graduate or you have less than 2 years of work experience, I think the education should be on page one. I think we're talking about more experienced people here, but if you only have 6 months of experience, yeah, typically I would want to see education on page one for new graduates.
Because I guess you've got nothing else to
experience. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, you've got nothing else to showcase really at that stage. So
yeah,
that's valid.
But then at 6 months, and even when people are undergraduates, I think there's lots that they can be doing to show some commitment, maybe to professional development, be that GitHub links, be it being members of coding clubs or doing charity work, that type of thing. So I'd actually rank that higher personally.
Showcasing projects you've been involved with, definitely a good point, Sophie.
Absolutely. And I think also when we talk about senior people, we talk about software engineering as an example, as Tilly mentioned. It's really interesting if you take people through to the next stage and just have blind code reviews. So people don't have the CVs, they don't have the individual's name, and then it doesn't matter at all, does it?
Absolutely.
I think that's really interesting as well about in terms of graduates and younger or less experienced people looking for job, highlighting some of the non-commercial projects they've been involved in. So whether it be, helping design a website for a university society or anything kind of like that is really useful, and kind of non-commercial applications of some of the technologies, just to show that interest, that passion, is really useful.
Yeah, just ever so quickly adding to that, like people at the junior end of the scale, that in many respects their CVs all look very much the same. They've all done the same computer science modules as part of their course or whatever it might be, and they've all worked on one project maybe. So they actually need to think more outside the box about how can they differentiate themselves from the next candidate. So those additional bits and pieces like community-based projects or members of coding clubs, Git profiles and repositories, etc. That's what's going to make those people stand out.
Yeah, good shout. Good shout. Okay, the next one. So skills summary. Again, we're focusing on tech roles. Skill summaries can differ in size greatly on CVs. I'm sure we've all seen CVs that have got a page or even more of different technologies that people have worked with, and I think it may well come down to that phrase, kind of worked with and exposure. We've spoken about Boolean searches. They are a factor in this. We know that CVs are picked up from Boolean searches. What would you say is, I think this is quite a tough question, but what would you say is the best way of people presenting their skill sets on a CV? Especially with so many technologies that organizations use now. There's sometimes 50, 100 different technologies in use within an organization. So how can they present those in the best way, do you think?
Study the job description, make sure that you're showcasing the most relevant technologies first. I think we can probably, if we're all working in technical roles, we've probably all seen those CVs that have a huge plethora of technical skills listed. It's like a glossary index almost. And what happens is that when you actually get into the nitty-gritty of it, you find out that some of these technologies have been very, very top level exposure, and that's not relevant to the role. So I would highly advise people to tailor this section to the position that you are looking for. Read what the basic requirements and the preferred requirements are for the position you're applying for, and shine a spotlight on the relevant tech stacks that you've worked with. if you're looking for a role that a senior Java developer and you have 10 years Java development experience, put that first and foremost at the, that should be way ahead of anything else after your summary and your name on your CV. But please, please, please stop sending me a list of 300-400 technologies that I probably have as much understanding of as you, because I've read about them on a web course or something. If you haven't used it and you can't bring that skill to the table for the role that we're recruiting for, it's not relevant. Leave it out.
Yeah, and just to add to that, completely agree. I think we've all seen the CVs with 50 different skills. Mention where you've used these skills in different projects, because there were so many times when someone mentioned the skills in the skills section or in the summary section, but then I would ask them, okay, so what technology did you use on that project? And actually they haven't used them. They last used them 5 years ago. So also ensure that when you maybe describe some of these projects I mentioned earlier, have 2 or 3 projects on your CV that you can talk about. Mention also what technologies you're using. It's so much easier for the recruiter to pick you for the specific position as well.
Great tip.
Sorry, go on, you go.
No, it's okay. You first. Go on.
No, you go.
We'll be here all day, gents.
I was just going to say, back to Ben's point, you may well get through the CV screening process with this big list that says you can do everything, but the bottom line is anything that's on your CV, you need to be prepared to be challenged on in the interview. So if you say you can do X, Y, and Z with all these different tools, that the interviewer may choose to zone in on something, and you're putting yourself in a position where if you don't know enough about that subject, you could flunk the interview even though you've already got through the CV screen. So you really need to be honest about what you can do, and put the right things on your CV.
Definitely.
The only small additional tip I was going to give is, where appropriate, include the versions and of the technology that you've used. I think a lot of them people have experience, but it's outdated. Or sometimes business is looking for a very specific version of that technology. So again, for your own sake, so you don't get tricked halfway down the process and kind of wasted your own time, make sure you're using or explaining on your CV which versions of those, if appropriate, too.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Tilly. The other thing, I'm not sure if anybody else feels the same, but the CVs where people grade themselves as basic, intermediate, expert. I literally hate that. Everybody's version of expert, I think, differs.
Yeah. So your subjective opinion of your skills is unfortunately not going to be relevant.
No.
And weirdly, no one ever puts themselves as adequate or poor, do they? Everyone's kind of proficient and expert.
Intermediate or expert.
Exactly. So either, if you want to do something like that, you could use more of a chronological history. So maybe mention you've used something 6 months versus 5 years or 10 years plus, maybe.
All good points.
Not good.
Yeah, there's you do see quite a few CVs, don't you, of people who've kind of graded themselves as a 1 to 10 or average to excellent in a particular technology.
I think Margaret's point is the best to use in that instance. If you do feel the need that you want to grade yourself, don't just highlight how you've used that technology in a project instead. Let me see the complexity of how you've used this technology. Let me see how deep you dove into that tech stack. Don't just put 9 out of 10, because that doesn't give me any relevant information to take forwards to a hiring manager. However, if I can go to that hiring manager and say they've utilized this language on this program, this was the kind of complexity that they were working to, the architecture level, that's gold dust. But a simple 9 out of 10, unfortunately, I can pin a certificate for whatever I want to my fridge, but it doesn't mean that I'm an expert in that subject.
Okay, all right, thank you. We're doing okay for time. Got one more of our kind of allocated questions, and I've had a few coming from different people on YouTube as we've been talking. So this is an interesting one, because I think increasingly it's going to become important. There was always so much talk about interview etiquette and interview dress codes and kind of first impressions of walking into an office and shaking someone's hand and going into a meeting room. Obviously, because of what's happened, That is largely not happening at the moment, albeit it's starting to come back in kind of dribs and drabs. So forums like the one we're using now, Zoom, is where a lot of, I'm sure, your interviews are being conducted right now. So have you got any tips for people on etiquette around this? I mean, I see that just looking at everyone here, we've all got nice backgrounds and things like that, but is there anything that you're kind of expecting of people before they click join to a Zoom interview with one of your managers?
I guess there's a kind of checklist of things to make sure of. First of all, like if there's other people in the household, like make sure that you're not going to be disturbed and things like that. I'd recommend, you know, not having TVs and radios on in the background. You know, it's a nice quiet location. You're not going to be disturbed. Potentially, like you say, you can see all of us, you know, pretty nothing too outrageous sat behind any of us where we've chosen to conduct the meeting as well. But I sense that part of your question might be around how even like the person might dress to present themselves for the interview and stuff like that. So I think it's important that the person would actually research the company that they're interviewing with, and through their website or speaking to other people, have a feel for the culture of the business and see what might be appropriate, because it might be different dress code for a finance or legal type organization as it might be for a retailer or a tech startup, for example. You just need to try and, it's all part of your interview preparation and research, but really get a feel for the vibe of the business that you're interviewing with, and dress appropriately.
Not to disagree with Lee there, but my opinion would be that the onus there is on the recruiter to actually prepare the candidate and tell them to set the expectation for the dress code. Because if you sure, it's always important to make an effort to do research and background checking into the company that you're interviewing with, and definitely you should make an effort to make sure that you are uninterrupted and that you have made an effort with your appearance. However, I think that nowadays a recruiter, when prepping you for an interview, should tell you they're expecting you to turn up suited and booted, or don't worry, it's a very relaxed format. Everybody will be in chinos and polo shirts, or, you know, you can get away with a t-shirt. I think the onus there is definitely on the recruiter to set that expectation, because it's actually quite uncomfortable sometimes as an interviewer when you're sat as a panel and you're all dressed quite casually, and then somebody comes in a three-piece suit with their shoes shined and a tie on. It makes them feel, you can tell instantly that the candidate becomes really uncomfortable then. So I really think that part, it should be on the company's onus to set the expectation.
Absolutely.
Because I suppose it actually has a knock-on effect to potentially how comfortable that candidate feels in that.
Absolutely.
If they have misinterpreted. Do you think, this is kind of extensions to this question, sorry to interrupt, do you think that overdressing is as bad as underdressing, if there is such a thing?
I'll let someone else take the floor on that one.
I mean, I think overdressing is better than underdressing. A friend of mine who's a recruiter, she once interviewed this developer. I mean, the guy was lounging on a sofa in his t-shirt.
Oh yeah.
It's like, it's completely ridiculous. So I mean, as you've said earlier, I think it depends on the company. If it's a consulting firm, if it's a bank, you know, honestly, I think it's better to overdress rather than overdress, right? Maybe you don't need to wear a three-piece suit, but you should definitely wear a shirt. So I think it's definitely better to overdress. However, I have recruited for e-commerce companies like Expedia, for example, or Photobox. And we had situations when the hiring manager, actually remember once we had, well, I wasn't a developer, but we had a guy coming in for interview for an interim CFO position. So I would imagine that you need to wear a suit, right? And actually the main CFO, he thought the guy seemed too corporate. I'm like, come on, like, you know, they are dressing up for the interview. You know, they should be doing that. So anyway, so yeah.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think
recruiter for sure.
Overdressing is probably a worse crime than underdressing.
Really?
In this, overdressing, no, underdressing is a worse crime than overdressing. Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, you could always. I always say this about people on the first day. If you're in two minds, maybe go a bit smarter, because you can always kind of drop down a level where it's harder to, you know, rock up to work on your first day in a t-shirt and then the second day put a suit on. but I agree with Ben in a lot of ways that the recruiter does need to set some expectation there, and sometimes it's unfortunately it's not even as clean as industry. Some hedge funds which would be finance might be really relaxed because they're quite a small, intimate and like working environment, etc. I think just broadly speaking on the video interviewing piece, I don't envy candidates having to do it. I think it's it gets from what people are used to. I think it is a big step away. So I think there is again a responsibility on businesses to make people feel quite comfortable through that, appreciate that it's new for them, and whether that be prep from the recruiter and giving them a bit of a feel for what that's going to look like, maybe giving them a few allowances and making sure that we're not overly judgy at that point. And because there's an element of being quite organic, isn't there, in a video interview? What you don't really need is someone who's got a shirt and a tie and a suit on his top half and just had some sports shorts on his bottom half just because it's not on camera, right? We want them to feel relatively comfortable. We should appreciate they're going to be they are working at home, and we wouldn't expect them to necessarily follow a strict dress code on any video calls or meetings that they attended should they be employed. So to be kind of overly judgmental at that point, I'd say it's responsibility of the business to not and make people feel comfortable in this new world.
I just maybe add then, so based on like the points that Ben and Tilly have made about that, obviously the recruiter is at hand to help you out. So yeah, I feel like if you're unsure, reach out to your recruiter and ask them 100%, and they'll give you a steer, and then obviously you don't have to worry about it.
I suppose that one of the key benefits is that actually people get to see that candidate in their natural environment, in their natural habitat. When someone walks into an interview room in person, then you make an opinion based on that sort of first impression and everything else. But when you get the chance to see them at home with their kind of background, and you get to start to get a feel of what this person is all about, which I suppose in many ways is a good thing.
I've got a picture of a martini behind me, so I probably wouldn't.
Yeah, Matt, one thing that I'd like to add to that actually is I've seen a lot of candidates get flustered when something, like Lee correctly said, make sure to negate any issues before they happen. But if something does go wrong, if your toddler does come tearing into the room where you're sat interviewing and start screaming mummy mummy or daddy daddy or whatever, if your cat comes tearing across, whatever happens, give yourself a deep breath and relax and understand that this won't be a unique instance. The person interviewing has probably had that happen multiple times. It's not a big deal unless you make it a big deal. Just take care of it, get yourself set, and get back to the interview, and don't let it fluster you. Don't become obfuscated with your answers, and just stay on point. And yeah, I think it's super important in these times to just give yourself a break. Understand that everybody's in the same situation. We're all sat at home. We've all got our family lives a little closer to our working environment than we're used to. These things happen. It's normal. Don't worry about it. Just drop it and move on.
I'm just conscious of time, but I do, if possible, want to catch you for one more question. So this has come directly from a candidate I've been talking to recently about trying to find work, and she sent me a few questions, and one of those questions, and I suppose it's the most kind of human of all of these really, is if you see a job and there's already 200 applicants for that job, is there any point in still applying for it?
Right. I mean, what I would just say, try to find out who the hiring manager is, because I've recently seen a job in talent acquisition with 195 applications, So, I mean, yeah, I probably wouldn't apply if there were 800 applications, but the thing is, half of them could be unsuitable. I've seen some of the roles where I had 76 applications. That was before COVID-19, and, like 30% of them were suitable. So I would say, try to find out who the hiring manager is. You won't always be able to know, right? Especially if it's a massive company like Amazon and there will be different managers, but you can typically, like, who is the, who do you normally report to within an organization? Try to find out, try to network within the organization to find out who the hiring manager is and just message them directly, just express your interest in the role. If you can't do that, connect with the recruiter. Again, there might be multiple recruiters within the organization, but try to connect with someone and try to find out who might be suitable, who might be responsible for the specific position. So I think it's absolutely worth applying, but I wouldn't just apply and wait and hope for the best.
That is the best tip anybody could give on that. As Margaret said correctly, if you see a huge pool of candidates already applied to a role, you should try to bypass that in any way that you can and remove the competition. It's a competitive market. It's a competitive industry. You have to compete. What I would say, though, in parallel is that, if there are 200 applicants and you become the 201st, you're all going through the same process anyway. You all have the same chances. So if you still feel like you're a good applicant for the role, then it wouldn't matter to me if there was 100,000 or one application. I would still apply, because the other 999,999 candidates might get deselected and you might be the only person who makes it to shortlist. So there's absolutely nothing to lose, by putting your application in.
And in a boring point, when it says 200 applications, that's 200 people have decided to click apply on LinkedIn, is presumably where she's seen that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's taken them to the ATS, where people have maybe redigested the JD, not bothered to go through the full application process, etc. So the amount of people that have actually applied and got their CV to the business could be a lot less than 200. That's quite a boring recruiter point.
It's a great point.
Yeah, I never thought of that, actually, and it's true. I suppose people realise when they're filling out the form that it might not be right for them. But a lot of people might be clicking around, clicking that apply button, and maybe not pushing through with it. Yeah. Good. Okay. That was the last question. So I'm going to turn off the live stream. So thank you, everyone, for watching.